going to go through the phases, look at from where the CBMs or incidents at sea agreements started from, where have they developed, and how to put it in the present context of an IPOI outreach. And I will be giving specific examples of obviously USA, Russia, from where genesis of CBMs started, and then look at specific examples of India, Pakistan, and India, China, because that, to my mind, is the would form the base from which we can develop further. Because both, to my mind, have been sort of non-starters for a number of reasons, and there are certain issues that we need to examine holistically if we are going to look at NCBMs that is called, but I would like to say that we should look at maritime confidence building measures, because the naval aspect is one aspect of hard security part, but there is a view of holistic maritime security, and the IPOI 7 pillars cover most of them. So therefore, we need to look at perhaps in a little different manner. I will give you specific points. My idea is to throw up a lot of ideas and have some time more for discussion later on. And while doing so, I hope I don't set the cat among the pigeons. So just have a look at what are actually CBMs. There are very methods of looking. Many people call them confidence building measures. There are agreements. One could argue that UNCLOS in a way is also a confidence building measure, because for the first time it brought nations together on a common platform to understand the distribution or the constitution of the oceans, maritime zones, and a number of issues which down the line have been hijacked, and of course it's open to interpretation by various nations, and that is where the turning point in many of the arguments comes about. So essentially, these are measures to address, prevent, resolve uncertainties among nations, prevent hostilities or escalation of hostilities, and essentially build mutual trust. And that is the bedrock of any agreement or a confidence building measure, that there has to be a very high degree of mutual trust. Now, CBMs can be formal or informal. Today we are discussing CBMs. This could be an informal discussion. You could have it at track 2, track 1.5, or it could be at a formal level, which is track 1, which tends to become a little straight-jacketed. So an approach perhaps to push certain agendas which are a little sticky or prickly through track 2 or track 1.5, as has been mentioned by Secretary East, that we need to look at various think tanks that can engage further, and then thereafter transfer them to a formal platform where perhaps much good can come out of the initial discussions, which are more informal. Now, these can be unilateral, bilateral, multilateral, but there is a point I'll bring out later, which is that finally, at the end of the day, any agreement or any confidence building measure will land up being bilateral, because it will be one nation's view against the other nation's view, even under a multilateral agreement. Then, of course, they could be political or military, but I extend the argument to two more aspects, which I shall cover later. These can be state to state or non-governmental, which is linked with the first point of formal or informal. But essentially, it was between adversaries. Revisit the Cold War, revisit the build-up of global international relations after World War II. Essentially, this was between adversaries, and this is typical of a case between India, Pakistan, and perhaps, if you'd like to view it also in the maritime environment, between India and China. But today, we need to look at confidence building measures and agreements between not only competitors but partners, because the maritime environment has been extended and nations are exhibiting a deep interest in the maritime environment, not only for hard security issues or their own protection of sovereignty, to which some nations hold it very dear to their heart, like, say, China, but also because of the understandings of what is many points have been covered, whether it's combating or addressing piracy, or it is maritime terrorism, but resources, ecology, and many other issues for which nations are looking towards the oceans. So let's revisit what are the genesis. So these CBMs in the existing format at which we look at them in terms of hard security were an ideal tool for the Cold War. Two main adversaries, US-led bloc, Soviet-led bloc, very clear-cut distinction lines. The dividing line was very clear. You don't do this, I will not do that. And it was all under the nuclear umbrella. The ideal tool for the Cold War, but the modalities and the methodology which is being adopted even today for maybe CBMs and incidents for agreement incidents at sea may not be the right form. Therefore, there may be a need to revise and relook how do we go about them. The aim was essentially to prevent accidental war, especially nuclear. So perhaps the nuclear CBMs across the board, the world over, have been perhaps the most successful, including the ones which India and Pakistan have signed, not to attack each other's nuclear installations. And of course, stem escalation in unstable areas. Today, we see an increase of instability throughout the globe, and in the Indo-Pacific is a very good example where you have hotspots spread all over the Indo-Pacific. So let's have a look at US-Russia. These are four acts or accords documents which, when I went through, I realized that these four form the bedrock of the CBMs. And this, of course, is after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think the turning point in which both nations realized we need to get something. So the Cuban Missile Crisis led to the establishment of a hotline between US and Russia. Then, of course, it was something that was carried forward by other nations. So you have the 1975 Helsinki Act, you have the 1986 Stockholm Accord, you have the 1919 Vienna document, and you have the 1992 Vienna Accord. So what is it that these four documents brought to the table for insofar as stability during the Cold War was concerned was, first of all, the first document, which is the Helsinki, formally recognized the status quo in Europe. I think that was a good point to be done, that the status quo was established between the NATO and the Soviet bloc. Plus, further on, the next one facilitated interaction in which observers were invited to military exercises on a voluntary basis. I don't remember if that has happened between India and Pakistan, but if I do remember correctly, there was one occasion on which there was observers were invited. Of course, mandatory on-site inspections and data exchanges, which is the most important aspect. That is detailed information on force deployments, major weapons programs, military budgets, and demonstration of new types of military equipment. You can, translate all these data exchanges to even to more holistic maritime security issues. For example, detailed information on deployment of fishing fleets when we talk about IUU, or if you want to look at preservation of ecology, especially the SDG 14, which says life underwater, below water. Look at major programs that nations are looking at in support of their oceanic views, or say, like, for example, blue economy, which is a point I will deliberate a little later. And budgets which are accorded, and then, of course, demonstration of new types of military equipment could be equated to sharing of capacity building and capability issues, which has been alluded to earlier. So this is a way in which we can metamorphose CBMs into a more practical aspect today. Let's have a look at, say, maritime CBMs now. So in 1972, the US and Russia signed an agreement on prevention of incidents on and over the high seas. Now, I've kept this in red. This is interesting. On and over the high seas, which meant that were incidents okay to happen in, say, EZ? Because do remember, 72, UNCLOS was coming of age. Discussions had been on for quite some time. They had started on earlier. There was a recognition of maritime zones. And just to give you an example, India's MZI Act of 1976, which predates UNCLOS, has all the necessary alignments with UNCLOS, because essentially it was drafted by the same people who also represented India on in UNCLOS, and therefore the inputs were taken. And 1976 is one example, so therefore 72 also, but it says on and over the high sea, so little gray area. But then if you look at the globe at that point in time, you had USA and you had the Russia, and therefore they were looking at maybe the battle at the Atlantic, or they were looking at the GI UK line where there was more, and you entered into the Atlantic, more high seas. Indian Ocean, and the Asia Pacific at that point in time was not supposed to be the battleground. So therefore there was a limitation in this. But Russia also signed certain agreements with several NATO nations over a period of 1986 to 2008, and they're all listed there. And interesting part, it said that this would be beyond the territorial seas. So from 72 to 86, of course, UNCLOS has come of age. It's been signed, ratified by many people except some nations. And therefore, it said beyond the territorial seas. So it became more and more specific. And this is understandable because the territorial seas are sovereign territory. The last 2008 is the year in which the agreement with Turkey was actually finally came into force, although it was signed in 2004. far as US-China is concerned, in 1998, there was a consultation mechanism to strengthen military maritime safety. It dates back to that much time. So this is one outreach of the US to China. And then, of course, you had the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which was signed in on 23rd April 2014 and endorsed in the Western Pacific Naval Symposium during the Chief Symposium. But discussions on Q started way back in 1993. Finally, all nations came to agreement in 2013, and essentially this provides Navy safety procedures, basic communications plan, and maneuvering instructions for ships and aircraft, essentially to avoid what we call in the maritime domain a close quarter situation. Do remember, INS Godavari during an anti-piracy patrol was touched by a Pakistani naval ship. And this is something while we were addressing a common factor of piracy. So therefore, Qs in a way provided these, or what we call standard operating procedures, and I will refer to this a little later. But do remember this Qs aspect because it's important when we look at establishing, say, CBMs with China. Insofar as India-Pakistan are concerned, 1991, there was an agreement between India and Pakistan for the advance notice of military exercises. This was a very broad-based agreement. Insofar as the maritime element in this was concerned, it said that the exercise involving 6 or more ships of destroyer or frigate size and above, exercising in company and crossing into each other's EZ. I'll show you a map which indicates the EZ and the details or the exchange of information required to be done was type and level of exercises, general area of the exercises defined in latitude and longitude. Naval officers will understand this, and also mariners will understand that although the ocean and seas appear to be big, the moment you put elements of maritime marine, of naval forces, of fishing vessels into a sea or an ocean, the space becomes more and more restricted. And that is very true of the North Arabian Sea. And then, of course, what is the planned duration of these exercises? Then, of course, there was an understanding that ships and submarines not to close less than 3 nautical miles in international waters. Now, this international waters is a term that is a Western origin term and essentially applies to sea areas beyond the territorial sea. But there is no international recognition of this term. UNCLOS does not mention it. Either it should be in areas beyond the territorial sea. Therefore, we are a little more specific, but that is an aspect that we can look at later. An aircraft will refrain from buzzing surface units and platforms in international waters. Well, I really don't know if this happens, and many at sea know how it actually happens. And of course, there is always the hand signals are always passed. But this gives a very little uncomfortable situation, especially when you are in, say, heightened tension states. Kargil war is one example. Then, of course, the Pakistan Navy did not move out, but for future, we don't know how it will turn out to be. So further on is this, then in 91, there was an agreement on prevention of airspace violations and for permitting overflights and landings by military aircraft. Now, interestingly, this agreement mentioned Indian Air Force and Pakistan Air Force. There's no mention of Army aviation or naval aviation in that, but certain aspects which are applied in the maritime domain, and of course the Navy follows it because it's an agreement between 2 governments, is that combat aircraft will not fly within 10 kilometers of each other's space, including ADIZ. I will show you a map to make it a little more clear so that you have an idea of what space are we looking at. And no aircraft will enter the airspace over territorial waters, which is the national airspace defined as per UNCLOS, except by prior permission, and that is a given in any case. Then, of course, February 99, our Prime Minister went across. We had the Lahore Declaration and the Lahore Memorandum of Understanding. One part or one paragraph of the Memorandum of Understanding signed in Lahore said that there would be a conclusion or the concluded agreement on prevention of incidents at sea in order to ensure safety of navigation by naval vessels and aircraft belonging to the 2 sides. Political intent was very clear that this is what we want to do, but then we had Kargil. After that, status quo. Nothing has moved after that. This is where we stand. So we do not actually have an agreement specific to avoidance of incidents at sea with Pakistan. And of course, when you look at the readings or writings today, this Lahore Declaration and MOU is hardly mentioned. So this is just follow the cursor, please. And this is just schematic diagram. It's not to scale or anything. So if this be the international maritime boundary line, which starts from, of course, the Sir Creek area, which itself is not very well. It's an area of dispute with India, Pakistan, unless it's the line, which means that this area belongs to Pakistan Maritime, and this belongs to India. And this is the western edge of our air defense identification zone. The Pakistan air identification zone is on this red line. It coincides with what is called the flight information region, for which Karachi is responsible for international aviation. It's essentially for safety of air travel and civil aviation. But this is it, and this is the line, if I remember correctly, is at 22 degrees 30 minutes north. So you can see how much of an area is there out here. So just to put it again into further context is just to see that this is the EZ of nations in the Indian Ocean region. And of course, you can see that the red lines marked out here indicate the extended shelf submissions made by both India, Pakistan. And this is the EZ of Pakistan out here. And here is the ADIZ line. As I said, the North Arabian Sea can become a very small place insofar as sea room is concerned. The same would apply to the South China Sea, which is dotted with islands. And then, of course, you have a lot of military activities, naval activities taking place today, with many nations, with the latest being the UK task force, carrier task force moving through the South China Sea. And we expect them back to come and RVS for operations there. But this is just, I thought I just put this in context that when you look at the whole Indian Ocean region per se, this is one area of issue here. There, let's say, for example, we had a problem with another nation. The whole picture becomes a little bit more complex. India, China. Essentially, it is guided by sensitivity and actions on the land border. Galwan is the recent example. If there was any hope of progressing any further, I think that has come to a standstill. But there's this is a point that we must understand, that dealing with China is not the same as dealing with any other nation. For their interpretations vary as per their requirements and national interest. Sir?
2 minutes.
I'll speed up, sir. Then, of course, the Chinese approach to queues and the code of conduct. Chinese very clearly say that even before the ink was dried, they said this is a bilateral issue. We will take it out with nation to nation. We've had maritime dialogues with China in 2016, 2018. Then, of course, Galwan happened. What are the impacting factors? Trust factor very low. Chinese view of the Indo-Pacific is totally different. They don't expect the term. Then, of course, Quad has come about. Then, of course, China-Pak relations, and perhaps the new kid on the block is China-Taliban relations. How are we going to do with Afghanistan? So if this is going to drive our relationship with China, then maritime Cbms with China are a little long shot. Certain elements, trust, confidence, what is the guarantee? In 2012, China objected to the use of the word code in queues and said it's too binding. Post-signing, they said this agreement is a recommendation, not legally binding, voluntary, not applicable in territorial seas, applicability of usage, where and when dependent on bilateral talks. And that's a methodology they adopt. But main thing is that nations who understand the dangers and outcome, and examples is between US, Russia, that despite the 4 examples I've given you, the CBMs have held. International nature of maritime domain, international laws and conventions acceptability. I gave the example of UNCLOS, whether it is looked at as an agreement and could enhance CBMs. Common denominators we need to look at search and rescue, safety of life at sea, natural disasters, climate change, choke points, and slogs. Blue economy is something we need to look at. Freedom of navigation would be the issue of commonality between nations. If there is a difference in opinion, CBNs cannot progress. And in this overall ambit, you have IPOI with all the 7 pillars. But then realignment of strategic partners and the agreements or understanding on rule-based order may underline CBMs if you are looking at talking to various nations, depending upon their view on the realignment. And one example is, say, India-Russia relations. And now there was a news report I read that we are looking at a trilateral between India, Russia, Japan. Sovereignty issues will rule the roost. And then, of course, attendant to that is maritime zones, that where there is a sovereignty disputes, maritime zones will automatically be in disputes. Therefore, how would you come about with a maritime confidence building measure or an agreement? Types and contents of CBMs. I mentioned earlier, political, military, cultural is an accepted fact. How about economic CBMs? We need to look at that. Consultations, dialogue, meetings is one form. It could be formal or informal. When you have a declaratory agreement, it's at a political level. But the main issue is notification of exercise airspace violations, access, information exchange. How many nations will be willing to actually share the actual details? Then, of course, the essence is rules of conduct, actual actions on ground, Communication hotline is required. Standard operating procedures like queues, they need to be discussed. But the point to remember is that overall, the relationship will remain bilateral even in a multilateral understanding. Finally, it is between two nations to decide what route they want to follow. So if the aim of CBMs is transparency of intent and action, then we need to reduce suspicion to avoid conflict, localize and terminate conflict at an early stage, like say Kargil, we localized it, look at escalation management, and finally disengagement. These need to be addressed, tailored as per the environment. Therefore, you need to look at political, geographical, cultural, economic issues in an environment. A CBM, say with China in the IOR, may be different from a CBM in South China Sea. This is something we maybe need to discuss and look at. You cannot have the same template for everybody, but the main essential is the will to accept adherence despite differences. What about national interests? Will even strategic partners agree on certain aspects when their national interests are impacted upon? And therefore, in any case, no nation will accept to be legally binding. So if you're looking at reasonable success, we need to look at agreements and CBMs for specific aspects. IPI covers them a lot. We need to discuss it by, try, and multilateral dialogues. We have a number of them. India, Indonesia, Australia. We have India, Australia, Japan. We have India, Australia, France. We need to extend this ambit. And with that, sir, I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Sarojit Parmar. I think it is a very vast topic. You had to, put in very concise terms. We'll take it up further during discussions. Now, may I request on the Dr. Commander Arnab Das to speak to us on the maritime domain awareness, which is very, very key aspect of ensuring maritime security. Over to you. Arnab, you're muted. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, sir. Sorry for this opportunity. It's indeed an honor for me to be able to present my work and what we are doing in terms of the underwater domain awareness, which is a very, very critical component of the MDA that we want to discuss today. So I'll try and cover under these heads. Now, in the 21st century, it is very evident that the entire maritime engagement has shifted to the tropical littoral waters. And we must appreciate that the tropical littoral waters have a very unique characteristics. And when we look at whether it is MDA or underwater domain awareness, the deployment of sonars become the key here. And we in the Navy have the experience that when we bought sonars from Russia and they were tested in the North Seas, the performance degradation when we get the same sonar to our waters is close to 70%. Mind you, it is 70%. So what does it translate to? Any meaningful deployment has a huge limitation. I mean, the deployment of asset becomes almost 8 times to cover the same area. And it is not only the poor performance, it is also denying multiple features that are possible when the performance is better. So it is very important that when we look at, and I think MDA must look at the underwater, and underwater is a very, very different kind of paradigm, which all of us must understand. And the relevance of the Indo-Pacific, I don't think I need to talk too much on this, but the important aspect that I want to bring out here, and particularly in terms of the maritime security, is the submarine deployments. I mean, the submarines have again found a lot of importance now, and more nations are getting into the submarine operation. But what we miss out, particularly when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, is the hardware versus the software debate. Now, hardware is something which most of us have been getting into. I mean, moment we say that we need to do something, the first thing we do, many of our developing nation, is pick up a lot of hardware. But do they work in our waters is a question we need to answer. And so the underwater domain awareness becomes a very, very critical here, and this requires indigenous effort. To give you a very strategic perspective on that, now if that 70% degradation, with our localized effort or localized R&D, even if we can improve this performance, just to give you some numbers, a sonar range is typically about 32 nautical miles. When it comes to our waters, it becomes about 5 to 6 nautical miles. So now it is not only the higher deployment of asset, it is also many features like classification of the target and all that is severely compromised. Now, even if we can make this 5 nautical miles to 10 nautical miles, which is not so difficult, it requires a little bit of effort, but it is possible. If we can do that and we have a focused approach there, we have such a tremendous, I mean, our entire asset deployment from the present becomes half. Not only that, we deny our adversary of, that advantage. So it is a 4-time advantage that we gain in our water. So something we need to really look at. And just to give you a sense, the Chinese are doing a tremendous amount of undersea mapping in our waters. 2018, there were 24 research expeditions by the Chinese in our waters in the Indian Ocean. Whereas the other 6 countries put together, including US, France, India, UK, and some others, was just about 26. That is the aggressive, data collection which the Chinese are doing. And this data is not just for the military purpose. This can be used for so many more stakeholders. We need to take note of this. And when we say other stakeholders get into this, then they can also pull in resources while we are getting into these kind of efforts. Now, you must appreciate that the Indo-Pacific strategic space is the tropical waters of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So this tremendous, the limitation of sonar performance impacts all of us. And the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific must be understood in its strategic context. Unless we appreciate that, the NDA becomes quite superfluous or quite on the surface. Now, India's position in the Indian Ocean is, I don't need to explain this, but what we can make out here is, I think India is the only country in the region which has the capacity. And we must understand what do we mean by capacity and capability building. It is not about going and taking some training lectures, and it has to be a comprehensive thing where we are able to position ourselves from the research perspective that we have something unique. We have been importing a lot of hardware, but these hardware do not work in our waters. So a lot of this spending has not been useful to us. We must appreciate that. A lot of the military hardware that we have bought does not give us, unless we focus on the soft capability, and which is our strength. Algorithm development is our strength. It just needs to be kind of channelized in a more specific manner. Another aspect is, if you look at the regional and local dynamics, just to explain this, the pre-modern states, so the political and cultural aspects have to be understood. How do we get these countries together? The entire Indian Ocean is so fragmented. Unless we are able to position ourselves as a leader, and I think that is the main crux of the Sagar vision by the Honorable Prime Minister. But how do we implement that leadership position on ground is what we need to look at. So this has to be done through effective capacity building. Typically what is happening is that the fragmented geopolitics is allowing the extra regional powers to come in, and it is impacting our safe, secure, sustainable growth model. Safe is safety from natural disasters, security is well understood. And sustainability is not just the ecological sustainability. There's so much more that we need to understand and implement. Now, going forward, even the UN has taken up this very seriously. The Sustainable Development Goals are very, very important. But how do we implement? The SDG 14 is life underwater or life undersea. But unless we understand this again calls for a better UDA. So today, I think in India, we are at the first dotted line. We have to make sure that we understand the waters and bring effective regulation, which has a deep understanding of the dynamics of the underwater ecosystem. Now, these binaries have been an issue. Not only within the country, there are more than 17 ministries looking at these aspects. And when I talk about underwater, I'm not just focusing on the maritime front, but also the freshwater systems. There again, these issues are there, and there are so many different ministries, agencies involved, and how do we bring them together is a major concern all of us need to handle. Post Cold War, the technology development has been very, very different. The underwater technology development happened in the UK Iceland gap, and I mean the Guig Gap, as we say. And but those conditions are totally different from what we face in our waters or what we face in the Indo-Pacific. The tropical waters are totally different. And how do we channelize them? Democracies have their own challenges. I mean, the budgets have to be balanced between socio-economic issues and the security. So these all things need to be put together, and the model that we try to develop, I mean, particularly when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, the countries are developing countries which cannot afford to spend too much money or prioritize security. So how do we bring a comprehensive framework is what we need to look at. I mean, India in the 21st century, there has been a lot of declaration, but on the ground, we need to really synergize the efforts and bring all the stakeholders together. I mean, even the demographic advantage, as we say, has to be managed very, very effectively. Otherwise, we are going to be facing huge demographic challenges going forward. I mean, these are such big efforts. I mean, just to give you an example, the Sagar Vision, and to support the Sagar Vision, the Sagarmala project, the Bharatmala project, such huge projects, but most of the contracts are going to foreign vendors, because we have not, I mean, our academia has not shaped up to support such big visions. And the biggest problem that we have is when so many foreign companies are coming in to for such projects, the entire resource mapping is going out of the country. Even from an environmental impact assessment also, this should not be going to foreign companies. It has to be done by indigenous efforts, because the entire mapping, the entire details goes out. I mean, what happened in Afghanistan, I mean, the entire natural resources have been mapped, and now the game of $1 trillion resources is being played up by the superpowers. So that has to be understood by us. I mean, that is a very major dimension of the security that we talk about. So how do we build this up? Just to give you an example, water is such an important thing. In the next 10 years, we're going to be having large parts of India having severe shortage of water. I mean, here again, how to manage the groundwater, how to manage our storage dams, everything has underwater domain awareness, and what we use the sediment management issue. And again, water quality. I mean, this just gives you an example. It is a huge problem, the quality of water for domestic. And these have typically what is happening, water resource management and water quality management are being done in isolation, being done independently. They have to be done together. I mean, they have so much linkages. So how do we build this together? And again, a huge amount of underwater domain awareness plays up in this. Capacity building. Now, inland water transport is a huge project, not been able to take off much because the capacity building has not been done. We've been making too many announcements about new economic growth. How do we build capacity? How do we build, our people to get involved is something very important. I mean, just to give you an example, when we talk about Sagarmala, underwater sediment management, port management, everything is so much underwater, but not a single academic institution in the country teaches acoustic survey as a subject, or acoustics is not taught as a subject in any academic institution. We were, we made a complete program on acoustic survey, went to the AICT, and they've approved in 1 week. And this is something which we can now. We have now also developed multiple programs on blue biotech and also AI and robotics specific to the underwater domain awareness. And these all can be taken up in various countries globally. I mean, particularly when we talk about the Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative, this can be an export from us. And India, with its manpower, I think now even the skill ministry also is looking at. So the same lot of programs have also been approved under the skilling part of it has been approved under the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana. So we are now trying to work out with various academic institutions. But these are the strengths that we have, and this can be really taken up. We could do good for ourselves, and we can also use it as a diplomatic tool going forward. And how do we bring those regulatory framework? And in the underwater, the most important is the monitoring mechanism. I mean, that is what we need to understand. This is a simple thing that we build up based on the AIS data. The entire shipping traffic and the ship static and dynamic data of the ships were used to build an underwater noise map. And this particularly, I mean, the AIS analytics is also used for the MDA, the conventional MDA, as we call. We can, detect dark ships. But what about the subsurface dark ships? They all can be detected using this. This has been used for environment monitoring, and this was recognized as one of the top innovations in 2019. And when we went to France for the presentation, the European Union said, why don't you take it to the IMO? And now the IMO has taken up this, and we are now going to be talking about underwater radiated noise regulations globally. And I've now requested the government of India also to look at this. But these are very easy tools, very low cost tools, which can be developed now in the present availability of technology. This is so easy to do. Just that this needs to be scaled up across. I mean, even for inland water transport, this can be done there and implemented at very low cost. And our youngsters are very good at all this. I mean, we in terms of environmental degradation, we can see these kind of in Maharashtra alone. I mean, that 720 kilometers of coastline in 1 year in 2018, we had 80 big whale strandings. The last picture is of Tuticorin 90 pilotless. These incidents are happening more and more frequently, and I think this is a cause of concern. And one end, when we are pushing for maritime activity, pushing for blue economic activities, we have to be mindful of the sustainability aspects. And I mean, we are not here to say that we should not go for development, but how do we navigate this in a more comprehensive manner is what we need to look at. Now, coming to the conventional MDA formulation, I mean, I would call it an event-driven thing when globally after the 9/11 and in India after the 26/11, there was tremendous kind of policy focus, and there was a lot of pressure, so to say, to build this up, build the infrastructure. But unfortunately, what happened was it remained a security-driven thing. And I mean, there are publications where even globally also the underwater component is largely, there is tremendous amount of gap. So how do we kind of take it up comprehensively? See, we, particularly in developing countries, we cannot expect the capacity building to be done just from the defense budget. I mean, definitely the Indian Navy has taken up a lot of effort and a huge amount of infrastructure has been built. But the underwater component still has a long way to go. So, I mean, we came up with this specific proposal of UDA or underwater domain awareness. I think the stakeholders are well known, but just to quickly explain, I mean, we are a strategic submarine nation. How do we deploy our platforms in a more effective manner? We had the Kasab incident. I'm sure we don't expect the next guy to come by a surface boat. I mean, there is so much of underwater robotics happening. What is our preparedness? Migrations, there is so much happening in our region. I mean, political instability is a very major concern for security. In terms of blue economy, Indian Ocean is a hub for energy security. So it brings with it a whole lot of other issues. How do we make our shipping sustainable? I mean, as I said, IMO is considering new regulations. Our shipping industry has to keep pace. I mean, when I proposed this, there was a lot of resistance from the shipping industry, but I think finally, almost in a year's time, they got convinced that, you know, it is going to be good for them. The second is the fishing. Now, I mean, globally, it is known since 1996, the fish stock is on the decline, but the bycatch is of the order of 80%. How do we reconcile this? How do we bring regulations which can manage shipping in a more comprehensive manner? All has to be under the realm of underwater domain awareness. How do we bring more technology into this? And it is, otherwise it is unviable, and we are heading for trouble. I mean, we are looking at the sea for more and more for you know, food security. But if we do not change our practices, I think there is, now the government of India has announced 4,000 crores for deep sea mining. But I think as a nation, the capacity building has to be at a very different scale. A couple of organizations cannot, I mean, as one of the very senior scientists said, at least 100x scaling up in capacity is required. Again, as I said, the environment and disaster management, I think there is a lot more with so much attention to maritime development. I think both sustainability and disaster management has to be, how do we bring more technology? How do we bring more, you know, now data science has come up in a big way. AI is there. But unless, I mean, they understand the domain, I don't think they can give us a solution. So we need more people who understand the domain. It has to be from the domain to the tools rather than the other side. I mean, they are only tools. How do we apply those tools is something very, very important. Particularly pure science and technology, our understanding of the ecosystem is extremely poor. I mean, let me use that word. I mean, we do not understand how the dynamics of the ecosystem work in our waters. So there is a lot of study that is required. Sustainability can be driven only when we understand. So again, underwater domain awareness becomes important. Now, just talking about the E is at 20 lakh square kilometer of area. can we put sensors in the entire region? Cannot. How do we build smart systems? How do we build proper? I mean, I was in Tokyo University in 2014, and I was part of various research cruises there. The entire seamless user academia partnership is something which we need to learn. How do we? I mean, we have such a huge young population who are aspirational, who want to be part of it. Just that they need some directions. This is the broad UDA framework that we have come up with. If you look at the horizontal construct, all the four faces of the cube give you the various stakeholders that we talked about. They may have the unique requirement, but the focus has to be acoustic capacity building, which is getting better sonars and understanding the waters. So this has to be everybody's, I mean, the core capacity building requirement. There are multiple aspects of acoustic capacity building. In my paper that I've submitted, I've given more details, but I will leave it at that. But when we look at the vertical construct, a lot of sensing is required. A lot of our regulations are taken from somewhere else, try to push it down here. It doesn't work. It has to be a bottom-up approach where we have a lot of data collection, a lot of analysis, and then policies are built. And when we look at our youngsters, I mean, this also gives you a sense how young people who are, undergoing some academic or young professionals can contribute or be part of this whole thing. And this gives a more systemized or structured approach rather than, now we see even many of our labs, big labs, national labs are doing overlapping projects. So this, the prioritizing for the government also becomes easier that, these kind of areas have been done. And this is a multidisciplinary approach. I mean, whether it is technology or liberal arts, everybody can be part of this. And so we have been doing multiple projects. More than 300 students and young professionals have come and worked with us and developed on various projects. Just to expand that, underwater radiated noise management I was talking about, Navy has a requirement of acoustic stealth, acoustic habitat degradation is a requirement, and also ship design. So the same kind of technology policy can be used by multiple stakeholders, and they all can pool in resources for the research part of it. Similarly, for sediment classification, again, the inland water transport.
Sorry, to interrupt.
Yes.
2 minutes. You got 2
Yes,
minutes.
yes, I will finish in next 2 minutes, certainly. So we can see, these kind of amplification can be done on various such things. We can talk about 10 more such models. We don't have much time on this. This is the broad UDA framework that we are talking about. I mean, the user academy industry partnership. You can see the various schemes of the government and how they can be put into this funnel, and we can get effective policy, innovative technology, and capacity building. And various stakeholders are given in this. So I don't want to spend too much time explaining this, but this gives you a general sense of how various schemes of the government can be connected. Make in India, Skill India, Startup India, Digital India, all can be put together in a very comprehensive manner. And this is what can be taken to various nations in the region. We are doing various projects. A lot of our work should also impact the communities. So we have also been working on certain, I mean, if time permits, later on I can explain the Q&A, how the shrimp farming can also have a security angle to it. And underwater search and recovery is such an important area. I don't think we are doing much on this. I mean, when an incident happens, if we then run to do things, it requires a different type of preparation. So we need to appreciate the uniqueness of our waters and play to its strength. I think it's well known. So if we look at the IPOI theme, I think the UDA framework is able to touch upon almost everything. And I think there is a security connection to every aspect of this. So not trying to elaborate on that. I have tried and covered some of the aspects already, and how we can put various, policy interventions and technology interventions and capacity building. So the way forward, I think it is important that we have a better understanding of the underwater domain, more data-driven policies, and so technology has to support this in a manner. I mean, acoustics is a really concern area across various institutions in the country, and our focus has to be real-world problem solving. So what we have proposed is a single umbrella of 5 sub-centers, research center which does site-specific work, and this has to be multidisciplinary, not just science and technology. Even underwater archaeology is a major part. How do we bring liberal arts into this? Skilling center, as I said, some of our programs have been approved. We are working on multiple other programs. Academic center, there are degree is very important in Indian system or in this part of the world. academic degrees have a lot of value that motivates youngsters to come into the system. Incubation center, there are so many ideas that need to be taken up, and a policy center. That is extremely important. Otherwise, the fragmented approach that we have many times becomes a big limitation in taking forward new ideas. So a strategy center is extremely important as part of the whole thing. All of them will be working independently, but there will be some synergy to drive this whole domain. We have already set up a center, and now we are working on a couple of more in different parts of the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arnab. I think you have covered a very vast area. I don't really see any questions in the chat box. So if I may ask, coming to the first part, Captain Parmar, when we talked of confidence building measures, any views on how do we try and, make, say, nations like, for example, China, which has not been, even obeying the UNCLOS or things like that. How do you sort of cajole or such countries which will come? Because most of them look at their interests and don't look at the overall perspective. Any views on these?
We all wish we had a magic wand that we could just wave it and everybody fell in line, but that's not possible, sir. So engagement with China has to be continuous, sir. And till the time I don't foresee them coming onto a common grid or an anvil by which means, say, a CBM or an agreement can be, or a CBM specific can be signed. An agreement perhaps, but then whether China will follow the agreement in letter and spirit is questionable. So the only issue will be continue to engage China on all various platforms possible, keep pushing our agendas with them, whether it is it's an Indian agenda, or whether it's Sagar, or whether it's an IPY pushed agenda, or it's even say under the ambit of Quad in case we have to push something. We need to keep engaging. That's the only way I see anything coming out, but I don't think we should expect a positive response from China at any given time, because they have their own agenda. They're on a collision course, and sparks will fly, but reduce the sparks, and to ensure that the possibility of conflict remains low, engagement on all possible platforms is my suggestion.
Thank you. I think that's a way. Would you also like to touch upon, Sakuja, your question? Yeah, please go ahead, Sakuja. You had a question.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions, one each to both the speakers. First to Captain Parmar, I've noticed that there are at least about 24 INCSI agreements across the globe. And if one was to look at narrowly in terms of the Indo-Pacific, I think there are about at least a dozen. Now, do you think there is a need to now a kind of an harmonization of the INCSI agreements across the whole region, since we are talking about this large, huge space? Or would you suggest that we still stick ourselves to localize the INCSI, because this is most of the time these are bilateral? And do you also see an opportunity to expand the queues that that could offer us some remedy, so that it is much more inclusive in terms of bringing, because there are already at least I think 20-25 members. Can we expand those to and bring in some elements of INCSI agreements into those? To Commander Das, now you talked about the underwater. You're absolutely fantastic presentation. You mentioned about the underwater domain. Your focus was on that. Why not? Because you're a specialist in that. My suggestion is that while that is very, very critical, what you mentioned about underwater, today we are confronted with a kind of a maritime domain awareness, which I shouldn't use the word confronted. Rather, we are familiar and rather socialized into MDA. Now that generally takes into consideration the surface part of it, or maybe a bit of space in it. All right. Underwater you're bringing in. Then we also mentioned about data. You talked about underwater ecology, environment. Do you think it is time that we change the lexicon of maritime domain awareness to read as marine domain awareness? Because it can be it could be broader, widening, encompassing, and bring in lots of domains. Your reaction, please. Thank you very much.
So specific to your question, sir, is that these agreements are essentially between nations who have a difference in opinion, or their stances are different. That is the bedrock of all these confidence building measures. Speaking of queues, now after it was signed in 2014, queues has sort of not shown its head up again. And the only nations who are following, say, the SOPs or the mechanisms which are being laid down are like-minded nations. So do you actually need to have a code of such a code between like-minded nations, given that at any given point we are actually exercises are taking places plenty. So there's an understanding in far as interoperability is concerned. To extend that the specific parts of queues or any other agreements would, again, I would, to my best suggestion is we have to keep it bilateral. Again, the bedrock is to avoid conflict, keep differences low, and to ensure that there is no escalation of any issue, whether it's heightened tension, and that may lead to, say, even a a mistimed judgment by a commander at sea or anybody for that matter, which results in a shooting war. CBMs are best left bilateral. The moment maximum may be trilateral, but again, if it's between like-minded nations, it has no meaning because you're already on the same page. You have to have two nations on different pages coming, and as I said, a CBM, say, relevant to the Indian Ocean region may have different parameters, say, compared to, say, the Persian Gulf or, say, the Indian Ocean region between the various nations, between the same two nations. So you need to weigh those aspects and then see whether you need separate confidence building measures for different geographical areas or aspects, or whether one broad brush will do. So that needs to be examined, and that's an understanding both, I would say, the adversarial nations or the competitor nations or even strategic partners, if required, need to come to an understanding.
So thank you for the question. Firstly, I mean, the nomenclature is not so much important, but our understanding. I mean, if you just look at the original definition of MDA, it covers the underwater also. But in the process of implementation, due to various limitations, whether it is resource limitation or human resource limitation, even in the American system also, if you look at the paper by Borges, I mean, he has mentioned the myth versus reality of the MDA. So that has to be sorted out. I mean, more from an implementation perspective. As far as the nomenclature is concerned, I don't think even MDA has that limitation. And then also who drives the particular aspect also makes a lot of difference. I mean, sometimes in the political system, there are certain events which, create that condition where the leadership thinks that this is to be given priority, or as we call focusing event. I mean, in our case, it was the 26/11, and globally, particularly from the American establishment perspective, 9/11 was that particular focusing event which led to this. But because it was and then whom do you hand over this to be driven? So that is where the problem is. So, I mean, I found this as an opportunity because the UDA per se has a very, I mean, even from the MDA, the underwater part requires a very different kind of a take, and it has to be largely science and technology driven. And that's where, I mean, with my background, I thought that this is a new definition which we need to create. But it doesn't take away anything from the MDA. I mean, just because the conventional understanding of MDA could not address this, so that's why. Otherwise, the name probably, according to me, doesn't make that much of a difference. It is how we drive it, and the way we have tried to push it. It has to be driven with more science and technology, and more than that, sir, it has to be a holistic approach. People have to come together. We have now approached the Niti Aayog that it has to be, the capacity building has to be a whole of nation approach. Otherwise, how much can the defense budget handle it, or various other organizations? I mean, we have too many different agencies looking at it independently. That's where I think the problem lies. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think we come to the end of our allotted time. We looked at one segment of the Indian Ocean Initiative, which is a very important segment of maritime security. And you'll all agree with me that both our speakers have, given us an in-depth presentation of both these issues, because maritime security is very key link to any oceanic initiatives. And I think the first part of it is the domain awareness of your assessing a threat or what is happening. And then the next phase is, of course, confident, because there are bound to be conflicts, but bringing in confidence building measures or understanding to the extent possible. There will always be differences. How best to avoid outright confrontation is what should be the aim. And I think another important point raised by uh, uh, Dr. Arnab, is about the interlink between academia and the users. Quite often there are two, they're missing. Either you go into too much of theory, you leave the practical part of it, or while you're looking at practical aspects, you miss out the basics of it. But I think it's been a very thought-provoking session. I'm sure more of it we'll hear once we hear the other sessions. So thank you very much once again, both the speakers and also ICWA for steering this. Now I hand you over to the host. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for chairing the session, and thank you to both the speakers. We will now take a short break of about 15 minutes and reconvene at 11:45 hours for the second session of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Murali, sir.
Namaskar, Professor Kulkerni. Can you hear me? You're muted, sir.
Nice. Can you hear me now?
Chattopadhyay.
Yes, I can.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Among the
Namaskar, Dr.
speakers, we have
Yadava.
Miss
I'm
Now we can.
Sulagna.
Yeah, Sulagna, namaskar, and Professor Kulkerni, namaskar.
Namaskar. Namaskar. So shall we start now?
I'm not sure the host has to give us the green signal.
Yeah, host is there now.
Pragya.
We will start with the session 2,
Okay.
which is on maritime ecology and maritime resources. In chair for the session, we have Professor Balasaheb Kulkerni. He is the Director, Institute of Science, Mumbai. Among the speakers, we have Ms. Sulagna Chattopadhyay, Editor-in-Chief, Geography and Iu, and Dr. Yugraj Singh Yadava, Director, Bay of Bengal Program, Inter-Governmental Organization from Chennai. May I now hand over the proceedings?
Thank you. I welcome all of you for this today's second
So over to
session
you.
on maritime ecology and maritime resources, which is a very important aspect of oceanography. Today we have two eminent speakers. First speaker is Ms. Sulagna Chattopadhyay, who is going to talk on marine litter and plastic pollution. Ms. Sulagna Chattopadhyay is Editor-in-Chief of Geography and Iu. Geography and Iu is a very famous magazine devoted to earth science, which is published since 2001. And till now, many issues have been taken out by Ms. Sulagna Chattopadhyay on ocean aspects. And she is co-author of two books, namely Climate Change and the White World, and Science and Geopolitics of Arctic, Antarctic, Himalayas. She's a member of National Biodiversity Board, and she has been awarded the Business Excellence and Innovative Best Practices Academia Award in 2009 by New Delhi Institute of Management. So she is going to cover one aspect of marine ecology, that is the marine litter and plastic pollution, which is a burning problem everywhere. Our second speaker is Dr. Yugraj Singh Yadav, who is Director of Bay of Bengal Program Inter-Governmental Organization Chennai, and he is going to talk on sustainable management of fish stock and IUU fishing, which is a aspect of maritime resources. Dr. Yadav started his career as a fisheries scientist in ICWA and then shouldered many responsibilities at higher position in fisheries sector, which includes Fisheries Development Commissioner to the Government of India and then Member Secretary of the Coastal Aquaculture Authority. He worked in several Southeast Asian countries in fisheries sector and aquaculture sector. He has published 150 research articles, which includes popular science articles as well as research papers in the field of fisheries science and aquaculture. His research interests are large river system, aquaculture, and sustainable fisheries. Role of code of conduct for responsible fishery. He has a passion of photography, and he has collection of more than 50,000 good photographs of fisheries and oceans. He is going to talk on this sustainable management of fish stock and IU fishing, which is also a very important aspect, so that fishery resources will be available to our future generation. So I request Ms. Sulagna Chattopadhyay to deliver her lecture on marine litter and plastic pollution in the oceans. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kulkerni, for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank Dr. Sakuja and the ICWA for having me on this very eminent person's panel. I will now try to share my PPT. I hope that works well. Is it?
Yes,
Can you?
yes.
So what I will attempt to do today is, try to provide a holistic view of from science to policy to geopolitics, what should I say? I mean, I wouldn't say circular economy, but the circularity of it it has to start somewhere and end somewhere in a circular manner. Then that is the way, we can bring in some change in the way we are functioning right now, especially where ecology is concerned and the environment is concerned. Now, just to start with the Indo-Pacific region, I hope you can see this map. Is the slides moving? The map is visible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so now if we can just look at this map and understand the region for about, just about a minute or so. So first is why this region is actually very unique. So first is freshwater rivers. If you see all the rivers draining into this area, we have a large number of, a lot of water coming into this area through various rivers all along this region. These rivers support very fertile plains. These plains are very heavily populated. We have coastal areas which are heavily populated. Most importantly, this is a monsoon region because this is different from any other region in the world because it's a monsoon region. And being a monsoon region, we have certain uniqueness which results in a certain kind of, what should I say? The washing away from the land is higher. The runoff is higher at a point in the year, which results in ramifications which we need to understand better. So we have cyclones, we have floods, we have storm surges, and we have a unique ecosystem of mangroves and corals, and we have high temperature and high sunlight in this area. So now when we see this geographical backdrop, it becomes easier for us to understand why we are compounding and why each problem is getting compounded day in, day out, when we are actually refusing to address it from a point of view that needs urgent attention. And I think this initiative that ICWA has taken, and of course the Prime Minister has taken for understanding this as a region, it's a very proactive way of looking at the problem in a holistic manner, because nothing exists in piecemeal. We have to see the region as a whole. So now, just to give you an insight about what is the risk of extinction of mangroves. So this is World Oceans Assessment Report for 2021, which says 90% of global mangrove, seagrass, and marsh plant species are at the risk of extinction. 90%. I mean, what are we going to do with our oceans if 90% of our biodiversity has a risk of getting wiped out? So, I mean, we really need to sit down and think about this. I mean, you can have everything in the world you want. You can have, and I am not belittling any, particular section. We can have a security. We can have a maritime jurisprudence. We can have all of that. But there will be nothing left if we don't have an ecosystem out there. So we need to address this. This is priority. Now, this is one data of CPCB, which is 2016, which says, I mean, of all this data, the only thing that is significant is 62%, according to CPCB, is directly entering the water. So whatever waste we are generating, 62% of that waste enters the waters untreated. Now, what are the stressors really that we are talking about? Population, of course, is a stressor. Migration, coastal population. Now, these are the stresses where, we are releasing directly into the oceans and seas a lot of nutrient loading, it's called. So a lot of things we are, without treating, we are sending it out. Then we have activities like illegal fishing, and I know the speaker after me will be talking about all of this. Then we have mining on land and on sea. We have runoff, which has a lot of chemicals. We have eutrophication, sedimentation. So this is just the stressors that is apart from just plastic. I mean, I want to lead you there. I want to show you that this is the entire gamut of stressors that exist. And among this are things like, governance structures, geopolitical instability. For example, the G20 report talks about Myanmar and how they're working a lot on marine litter, the G20 countries. But they're finding, in Myanmar, they are not able to do much because there is so much geopolitical instability in that area. So there's no headway. So there are these countries in this Indo-Pacific region which have different parameters for their, ecological footprint as such. And of course, among all this is climate change. And where we know that we will have, we will have things like marine invasion, we will have things growing which out of proportion, and that all is one side of it. So there is, the biodiversity stress. The other side, we have larger number of events, extreme events, which is going to add more water at one point of time on the land, which means more runoff, and which means that we have more plastics in the ocean. Now, four worst things. Now, what are the four worst things that we have right now? First is, these are the things that the environment really cannot take. I mean, they cannot assimilate, because there is a potential of every water body to assimilate to a certain point. But these are the four things that the water bodies cannot, including the oceans, cannot assimilate in a short span. It takes years and millions of years for the oceans to combat things like this. So first is petroleum. The second is fertilizer-based nutrients. Then there is toxic contaminants from the industry. We know about the Minamata tragedy, and that is, of course, toxic contaminants. And most importantly, plastics. Now, when we talk about plastics, there is this very interesting, paper that came out from this in 2016 by this Polish geologist. And he said that they suggested that plastic is actually becoming a geological indicator of the Anthropocene era. So basically, we have made such a footprint with plastic that it becomes part of a geology. I mean, geological, it takes years and years for geological stratifications to form. And if we are leaving a mark with plastic, so you can see how far we've gone with that. There's some data I've put out there about plastic waste and how much plastic waste has been produced globally. But what is significant in this is I'm just going to point out a few percentages. 9% recycled, 12% incinerated, and a 79% which is just washed into either the oceans or into the land or into the environment, which we have no account for. We don't know where nearly 80% of this plastic is going. We have no record. And in 2016, there's a lot of data all around the place, but it's just a trend that I want to show, that people might say, a few percentage is up, a few percentage is low maybe. But the idea is that about 80% of whatever plastic we are producing is not accounted for, which means we don't know where it is. And like you can see that, where municipal solid waste, one World Bank report, it's out there, where I just put it that 12% is plastic waste of just 1 year alone. Now I have a small video here. I hope it plays, and if it plays, I can just yeah. So now, with growing visibility in the plastic waste due to increased accumulation in select environments, we are not seeing that. We are not seeing plastic everywhere. We are seeing it in select environments, and there's a rising concern about the negative impacts on human health. And we all know that plastic waste does not degenerate very quickly. So we are clogging everything that we have, from water bodies to, our land resources. So we are, polluting and toxifying a lot of our areas. Now, here we see that a lot of what we dump are actually not visible, because it's not like this. It is floating at the top, but most of it is actually at the bottom of the oceans. And I'll come to that infographic a little later. And these these animals, they eat this, and there's a degradation of the biodiversity, and there's a toxification which happens to the environment. So it is an emerging imperative to measure the concentration of plastics which degrade into microplastics and which has entered the food chain. And not only are we eating the microplastic in our salt, this is a river. You can see how much plastic is on the rivers and how it gets washed out during monsoons. And when I was talking about microplastic, we find microplastics in food, in salt. There's a study of Indonesia which reveals that all their salt pans are contaminated with microplastics. And we have in fish, of course. And when the fish feed is provided for, say, chicken or other, for poultry or other livestock, fish feed is sent, and the microplastic gets into the environment through there, and then to the animals that we otherwise consume, and water and salt, and all of that is now contaminated with microplastics, which is extremely toxic for human health. So then it is time that we take stock of this. You can see the supermarkets laden with plastic. This is not the only plastic. We have plastic in our homes for everything. I mean, from our computers to our, this is what I'll come to later. These are the oceanic patches that have formed because of plastic. This is animals consuming, and this is a beach next to Mumbai, which is littered with plastics. I'll stop this here and move on and come to this infographic, which actually talks about what goes where. Of this, I will only take 3 points. The first is seafloor, where you can see 94% of plastics are at the seafloor. Surface, 1%. So you see huge accumulations, which are called, trash islands. There is a Pacific trash. There are trash islands. There are several of these trash islands, which is actually only 1%. And we have beach litter, which is, eyeful, and it looks horrible, but it is only 5%. So you can see the amount actually that has gone into the ocean floors, and how very detrimental that can be for us, and how alarming it is that we are not taking note of this, even now, even today. So moving on, like part of my talk was about marine litter. So I just wanted to define that marine litter is around 2 to 5% of mismanaged plastic waste. So it is a component of plastic waste, and I have talked about plastic waste in totality in this particular presentation. These are the ocean gyres. Ocean gyres are areas where the currents are circular, and these are the areas where we have these huge garbage bags, the islands, the garbage islands, where if you remember the Malaysian in 2014, when we had this Malaysian airline that went missing, and that was the first time those visuals came of this huge stretches of plastic floating on the water. And of course, in all that plastic, it was difficult to even locate, there's so much litter. So it was difficult to locate the aircraft. So these have no clear boundaries. They float around on the ocean. And again, I will reiterate, it is only 1% of what we see. Now, there are some, there's a lot of studies which are all around the region, which we have seen that there's seafloor debris around Indonesia has been mapped. There's floating debris that has been mapped. Then there's an Indian Ocean garbage patch in the Gaia, which I showed you in the map along. Now, this is an important study. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a little while, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. So mismanaged plastic waste is plastics in use, managed plastic waste, and then there is mismanaged plastic waste. So when we are saying mismanaged plastic waste, it also includes litter. So this study has been undertaken. The data is of 2010. Unfortunately, we don't have a world waste data after that, but this is the data of 2010. But there are certain other country-specific records that have also been used to do this. And of course, we see that affluent nature, all the affluent nations are better off where management of plastic waste is concerned. we see that again, the Indo-Pacific region, if you look at it, it's got this black patches or black dots on the grids, or black colored grids, which show that, this region is highly mismanaged, especially because of the population, the rivers, the monsoon, and all of the factors that I spoke about a little earlier. And it generates, according to the study, the largest tonnage of mismanaged plastic waste, making this the global hotspot for plastic waste at present. South Asia, as we can see, is the largest offender, and Africa also. But Africa has an interesting take on, because Africa doesn't really produce that much plastic. What it, however, does is import plastic. And because of their import from European countries and from other countries, the waste generated is much higher, despite the production levels being pretty low, or the per capita usage being pretty low. So, so therefore, we have here a number of cities that have been outlined by the study, which, so there has been a country-wise and a city-wise. So the highest polluting city is Manila, followed by Sao Paulo, because Amazon is, no, Cairo, I'm sorry. Amazon is the largest discharge, it discharges the largest amount of water in the global context. So obviously there's a lot of things washing in there, which makes it also one of the hotspots. But Cairo, and if you see Kolkata and Manila, both being in the Indo-Pacific region, and the other countries which we see there is New Delhi, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Bangkok, and Kuala Lumpur, again, all in the South Asian region. These are the top 10 polluting cities of the global context. Now we come to the overarching global. So now I'm stepping over from the science and the studies that show us the state of affairs to what are the mechanisms that we already have. So these are the global mechanisms that we already have, which talk about plastic pollution, which talk about hazardous waste. So we have the London Convention, and based on the London Convention, we have the UNCLOS, we have the MARPOL for shipping, and then we have the Basel Convention for hazardous waste. Now, these are the mechanisms which we all conform to in this region. But there is a growing momentum. Now, this is the area that I'd like to talk about a little bit, about how there's a growing momentum in the global fora. So there is of course, the UN Decade of the Ocean Science, which we are saying 21 to 30. Then 21 this year in February, we've had a meeting of the UNEA 5. It was where we talked about marine litter. 2021, again, we've had a G7 meet where India has conformed to the 30 by 30 targets, and India was invited along with Australia, South Korea, South Africa. And if you see them, they all conform to the Indo-Pacific region. Then we have 2021 G20 meeting for the Osaka Blue Ocean Vision, which is again about marine plastic litter. And we have the ASEAN, a very well thought out and a very lovely action plan that they have, again, on marine debris. BRICS meeting we had in August, where we also reiterated we have China in it and we have India in it. So therefore, the Indo-Pacific, the relevance for the Indo-Pacific region. And we talk about marine plastic litter as well. And we have SACEP in this area.
Conclude.
Yeah, So we have SACEP in this area, but SACEP hasn't been doing an action plan. They have done certain raising awareness about plastic waste litter, but not so much as a vision document or an outline for future trajectory of how this region should function as one cohesive whole. And we have upcoming events of COP15 and COP26, where marine will be again in the spotlight. Now, this is my last slide, where this is my proposal as to how we can talk about Indo-Pacific marine domain alliances and how we could harmonize beyond bilateral and beyond trilateral agreements that we primarily have in this region, so that we can have an Indo-Pacific ocean continuum. We believe there's continuum, everything, all the seas are connected. So there has to be something that works in harmonize the region. And for that, the most, what should I say, the low conflict area is science. Science is very low conflict. I mean, people collaborate for science across. So like I have given the example of the Antarctic Treaty, where, you can note that during the Cold War, the peak of the Cold War, amidst extreme distrust and animosity, diplomats designed a treaty that brought the needs of the global commons into focus. So global commons is the which we believe in, which our IBOI has also been saying that we believe in global commons, and that is something that we need to talk about and bring into the address and bring science at the center of this and call for an Indo-Pacific Action Program under an Indo-Pacific Science Forum. Now, the global problem is a problem of government to government. It can never be prioritized by industry or by stakeholders. It cannot be stakeholder-led. It has to be G2G. And because global commons is something like, if I don't use it, someone else will. So if I don't use the global commons, someone else will. So that is the kind of mindset that works in this. So therefore, we need to fulfill, this is my last slide, and thank you. We need to bring the stability of the global commons, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, and keep engaging China and India in collaborations of science. Thank you.
Thank you, Sulagna Chattopadhyay, for giving very informative lecture on very burning problem of plastic pollution. Now I request Dr. Yugraj Yadava to deliver his lecture.
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank the Indian Council of World Affairs for inviting me to this very important event, and in particular to Professor Sakuja, Angelina, and other colleagues in the ICWA. I must also thank you, Chair, for speaking so kind of me when you introduced me to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, before I start my presentation, my apologies for this bad throat, and you must be hearing a very funny and strange sound from me, but I think I'm audible and I'm clear. My presentation talks about sustaining fisheries in the midst of overfishing and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Perhaps in the world of fisheries, as on today, overfishing and IUU fishing is the most talked about subject. Nothing else is talked about more than overfishing and IUU fishing. Before I move to my presentation, I thought let me share a few words about the organization with which I work. It's a regional fisheries advisory body, and it was instituted in 2003 from a former field project of the Food and Agriculture Organization, which started in 1979. So together with the former program, we are about 41 years old in the area. Presently, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, and Sri Lanka are the contracting parties of the organization. And Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Thailand, they are the cooperating parties and are largely engaged through the Bay of Bengal Large Marine Ecosystem Project, which is a JEF-funded project. The organization assists countries in meeting their aspirations in a responsible manner, and also their regional and international commitments. To sum up, in the last 41 years, we are serving as a model for South-South cooperation in fisheries development in the Bay of Bengal region. As I said in the beginning, ladies and gentlemen, overfishing and IUU fishing are the major concerns in global fisheries today. And those who are following the debate in the WTO, you must be hearing that these are the two important pillars, along with the third pillar of overcapacity. Overfishing and IUU fishing, as I mentioned, are the biggest threats to the sustainability of marine fisheries worldwide. For stocks which are within biologically sustainable levels, the decrease has been alarming from 90% recorded in 1974, and the sustainable stocks at sustainable levels today are roughly 66%. For the period 2000 to 2003, the average annual estimate of IUU fishing is between US dollars 10 to 23.5 billion, representing between 11 and 26 million tons. And in the case of Indian Ocean, between 627 to 1,378 million US dollars. I'm quoting this from a publication by Agnew et al. Dated 2009. You see from the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen that the IUU fishing is almost closed to the fish produced or harvested by the developed countries, and it is many more times, 4 times more than the fish harvested by the least developed countries. So this indicates the magnitude of the IUU fishing worldwide. Recent estimates of overfishing and IUU fishing, they indicate, I'm quoting a figure of 2018, at the national level, 24% marine stocks in India were collapsed and 16% were overexploited. And since we are talking in the context of Indo-Pacific, I have taken figures of Australia and of Indonesia. In Australia, 20.3% stocks collapsed and 40.6% were overexploited. And in Indonesia, just taking into account their exclusive economic zone in the Indian Ocean, 25% were collapsed and 24% were overexploited. These figures are from the University of British Columbia, which runs a program called the Sea Around Us. And a recent study by FAO and the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization reported that the estimated illegal fish landings across the area of Asia Pacific Fisheries Commission, which is an Article 14 body of the Food and Agriculture Organization, it states that excluding South China Sea, 6.6 million tons in 2019 with a value of USD 23.3 billion were reported as illegal fish landings. The study reported that while IUU fishing is prevalent throughout the region, the concentration is around Arafura Timor Sea, Banda Sea, Savu Sea, Gulf of Thailand, and the Bay of Bengal. Overfishing and IUU fishing is not only causing extensive ecological distress, but they are also siphoning wealth from nations and small fishes. And I'm quoting a World Bank study entitled The Sunken Billions, which says that the lost economic benefits from poor management of the resources that inter alia include overfishing and IUU practices are estimated to be of the order of US dollars 50 billion annually. During 1974 to 2007, the cumulative global loss of potential economic benefit was in the order of $2 trillion, which is a huge figure. The losses represent the differences between the potential and actual net economic benefits from global marine fisheries. My apology. At micro level, overfishing and IU fishing reduces the fish available for the artisanal and small-scale fishers. It forces them to invest more, often through credit, and ultimately their cost of operation also goes up. We have examined the proximate cause and of course the root cause. The proximate cause of overfishing and IU fishing can be traced to management failure. But the root cause, which is more important, is the overemphasis on production. We know fish production system in vogue is a mass production system, and fishing at all levels, whether it is the industrial fishing or the artisanal fishing, has become highly efficient. While now we agree that there are limits to fishery, general tendency is to pass the buck. And the bottom line here is that ecological, economic, social, and institutional dimensions are often neglected, which ultimately leads to both overfishing and IUU fishing. Ladies and gentlemen, the livelihood argument for production centrism, and I would like to state here that investment in a production-centric system is often justified with livelihood for the poor. And since in the Asia and also in the Pacific region, the artisanal and small-scale fishers constitute the dominant segment, we always talk in terms of their livelihood. We also are aware that the unconstrained increase of artisanal and small-scale fishers can lead to a low-level equilibrium trap where small-scale fishers are forced to invest their surplus in improved production system to maintain the status quo. And you can see the ball moving from one side to the other side, which is an example of the low-level equilibrium trap. In the Indian marine fisheries, the production has increased from 2.29 million tons to 3.56 million tons in the last 14 years. The period I'm quoting is from 2005 to 2019. But the substantial changes in real variables, education, employment, housing, in terms of the small scale and artisanal fishers is not very impressive. The BOBPIGO advises moving from production centrism to value centrism. And here we refer to the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 14, and we feel that SDG 14 cannot be achieved without SDG 12, which is responsible production and consumption. In a value-centric model, the focus is on appropriation of full value of the catch by reducing wastage and promoting value addition. A value-centric management comes from moving from management to governance, where all stakeholders work together to upgrade the value chain. And the example that we quote here is of the pizza. Bigger the pizza, bigger the share. In the BOBPIGO, to substantiate our hypothesis from volume to value, we carried out a pilot in Puducherry. 20 gill netting fishermen. And gill netting, ladies and gentlemen, is a very efficient and mass-producing gear. They were encouraged to move to tuna handlining. And handlining is a very selective and a boutique fishing method. These 20 fishermen were linked with a woman small-scale processor named Anita, and her organization, or rather her brand, is Overfish. And we connected these fishermen to Anita to cater to Puducherry domestic market. The branding was fresh, unspoiled tuna. And the result was that change in technology from gillnet to handline changed and provided nearly double the price for the fishermen. And they reduced their production, which was also leading to sustainability of the resources. And there is a video on the YouTube. We have mentioned the link to the video. It's a 12-minute video. Kindly see if you find time. I'm now coming to the end of my presentation. And what we advocate is the ecosystem approach to fisheries management, which can sustain fisheries and which harps on three elements: ecological well-being, human well-being, and effective governance. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, the ecosystem approach to fisheries management largely meets our needs to engage in sustainable fisheries. We feel that a change from production-centric to value-centric approach can bring in the changes in a shorter time frame. With respect to IU fishing, which is a highly complex issue, it needs to be tackled at the national front through an effective monitoring, control, and surveillance system, and at the regional and global levels through a cooperative approach, including immediate neighbors and also the distant water fishing nations. With this, I conclude my presentation and thank you very much for a patient hearing. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dr. Yugraj Yadav, for giving very informative talk on the sustainable fishery stock and IU fishing. The Overfish model, which has been developed in Pondicherry, is very classic example to control, to have sustainable fishery and to control this IU fishing. I think such models are also necessary for in other areas on our east and west coast of India. The topic is both the topics are open for discussion. And if you have any questions, participants can ask questions. I don't see any question in the question box. I have one question to Sulagna Chattopadhyay regarding the control measures for this plastic pollution and marine litter. Because what happened, we talk too much about this plastic pollution. Everyone knows about this plastic pollution in oceans, marine litter in oceans, but there is a not large efforts on large scale to control that plastic pollution and marine litter. So what are your views regarding this curbing of plastic pollution and this marine litter?
So thank you for the question. It is on land. I mean, whatever we control has to be controlled on land. There is nothing that we can do once the plastic is out into the sea. It is way too expensive to try and control at sea. So it has to be done on land. Now, what we can do on land is what they call now the circular approach, which means that whatever you have to have a record of how much is produced. That means there has to be an industry linkage. The industry has to be responsible, which means polluters pay policy. And there has to be an idea of what is not really coming back into the system. So we need to know the gap. We don't know any gap. In India, we have no such study where we know the gap. Once you know the gap, you're able to address that gap. So how to do that is to set in, a recycle mechanism A lot of places they have, what we are addressing is banning plastics, plastic bags or plastic, single-use plastic. But that is not really stopping a lot of other plastic. For example, the pandemic had so much plastic and it's out into the oceans, and there has been a mapping for that also, that all these PPE kits and these masks and these gloves, and they're all out in the ocean. So we need to get them back on land, and there has to be a mechanism, whether you pay for it, whether you give them, in the countries abroad, you have, like, you can buy a ticket with, you put plastic waste and you can get a metro ticket or whatever. So there has to be certain mechanisms of getting the plastic back from the users. And these users are everybody. So there has to be a mechanism to bring it back and then recycle it and then use that recycled material. Because what is happening is, even when we recycle, we don't use that recycled material, which is the circular part of it. So that has to come back into usage. So we have things like floor tiles, road, to put it on with the tarmac, mix plastic with the tarmac, So there are a lot of these other solutions which are there for plastic, which does not allow the plastic to go into the water. Now, that's where we have to stop it. Plastic cannot get into water wherever that water is.
Okay, thank you, madam. We have one more question from meeting host. You can ask question.
We cannot hear you, Dr. Sakuja. No, your voice is not audible.
You're muted, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentations. I think very thought-provoking. First to Ms. Sulagna, this is about, you have suggested that we must have an Indo-Pacific Science Forum. I think that's a it's a great idea. But then, when you talk about a science forum, I think there are too many things that can be included in it. And here, if you look at narrowly, I thought it will be useful if we had something like Indo-Pacific Rivers Discussion Forum. And by your own, in your presentation, you remark about 79%, unaccounted for plastic, bulk of it coming from land through the rivers. So do you think it would be a good idea to have a more targeted kind of a forum in which we are talking about debating this issue about plastics at sea? Also, I also have, connected with this is the issue about, do you think we need to have a more localized, supposing we were to say, if we have it in Bay of Bengal, kind of a Bay of Bengal forum for plastics at sea, where we're talking about, after all, bringing in the rivers coming in, etc. So this is, your idea is great in terms of having a broader Indo-Pacific, but I think the functional level would be more towards having a more localized affair. And to Dr. Yadava, this is another one which you talked about, IU fishing. I think this is a very highly developed subject now. I mean, there is so much written about it. And I'm just wondering, at BOB, in your case, in your organization, are you also looking at things like, using blockchain, promoting this whole idea across the thing? Because technology is something that will help us now. We are all, you mentioned about, the artificial intelligence, etc. Now, do you think it's a good idea now to go into technology-enabled kind of a fisheries, dominated? I think maybe I'm suggesting it that, we make the fish wearable technologies, whatever they have, whenever anybody picks them up, of course, there is some technology available to us, through which we are able to detect where they are headed. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay.
With the permission of the chair, I mean, anyone.
Yes, sure. You continue.
So, Sulagna, you can take it first. Yeah.
Thank you. So that was an excellent observation, Dr. Sakuja. We need to start initiatives at a more local level because we don't have anything right now. So it is important that we start small and then scale it up. Having said that, rivers would not be the only, only parameter. There could be the addition of coasts as well. So it could be a river and coast kind of a forum, which includes the coasts as well, because a lot of, there's a monsoon, which like I was mentioning, so a lot of monsoon runoff is there, which just takes the beach litter into the ocean and far away into the middle of the sea. So that is one of the challenges that we need to address both. But also in that, it's not only about science, it is about It's about capacity building. It's about getting artificial intelligence to monitor. So we need technologies. So there is a lot of other things, even in a science forum. We cannot do only science anymore. There has to be appendages to it or addendums to it, which means a lot of other alliances, which would ultimately lead us to the geopolitics part of it, which would help us forge relations with other countries and make that into a viable system whereby people listen to you. I mean, the idea is to get people to stop. I mean, and for that, you need a consensus in the region. You can't get people to stop just like that. I mean, just on the basis of science, people are not going to stop. I mean, we've seen COVID, nobody stops on science. So there has to be an interpretation of science. And that is what is important in any forum that we set up, which is what I call the addendums. So we need an outreach and science and outreach of science and geopolitics. I mean, that is the link that has to be there. And this Bay of Bengal idea is excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, with your permission, Chair, if I can respond to the question posed by Professor Sakhuja. Sir, you're very right. I think technology has to be a very important component of any exercise that aims at deterring, curbing, reducing, eliminating IUU fishing from our oceans. And let me share with the House that in February 2020, the Bay of Bengal member countries, they had agreed to the first draft of a regional plan of action on IUU fishing. And then the COVID-19 came, and that has been a big deterrent. And although virtually we have been moving on the finalization of the regional plan of action on IUU fishing, but I think the final action and final decision will only be possible when we are able to meet physically across the tables and then sort out. And let me assure you that technology does form a very important component of the RPOA, Regional Plan of Action on IUU fishing. Now, what components are agreed by the member countries when we finally meet, that is yet to be seen. But we take your suggestion to include blockchain, artificial intelligence, and other upcoming technologies, and we would definitely raise it with our members when we go into the final lap of the RPOA. And we hope that very soon we would be able to do that. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions on this?
Professor Balasaheb, there's a question on the chat which says India well poised to become a net security provider in Indian Ocean. So you can direct it.
Direct to whom this question is?
Sir, any of the panelists.
Dr. Yugraj Yadav, you can answer this question.
Sir, I can only respond from the fisheries point of view. I think the distinguished speakers before me, Captain Parmar and Dr. Das, they would perhaps be much better poised to talk on the national net security. But I can say that yes, India is now moving ahead with the national policy on marine fisheries, and the new law on the Indian marine fisheries is also now being readied to be placed before the Parliament. And I think with these two developments, as far as the food security is concerned from the oceans, India would certainly be doing a good job. So I think from the food security point of view, I have given my viewpoint. But if Dr. Sanjeev Kumar has raised a question on the other security aspects, then perhaps Captain Parmar or Commander Das would be in a better position. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Yadava. Are there any other questions? Yes.
No questions,
Dr.
sir.
Parmar.
Thank you, sir. I just thought I'll add intervention on security provider issue. You know, when this actually this was again, it came out from the West, and we also lapped it up. And if you look at the Indian Maritime Security Strategy document of 2015, we addressed this issue because we realized that it was time that we told the world what we look at, what we think about being a net security provider, or whatever combination of words you'd like to use. So what we said was that we'd like to look at an area which is stable, secure, and peaceful. So these were the three pillars. But having said that, we have long come, we've walked the path long enough. And so instead of saying net security provider, which we have been looking at for some time, and the mere fact that we are now a preferred security partner, and secondly, and more importantly, we are the first responder in the maritime domain, we are well poised to ensure through collaborative means with other nations that there is some degree of net security in the region. And even in the document IMSS 2015, we said that we can't do it alone. It's not possible for any nation to do it alone. But given the fact of our geographical positioning, our capacity and capabilities, and our interactions at various levels over many aspects, of which maritime security is the main underlying theme, I would say that we have contributed a great deal. So I think it's time to let go of the lexicon of national security provider and look at the two aspects of preferred security partner and first responder in the maritime domain. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Parmar. Now I think so it is the time to conclude. Before conclusion, I thank ICWA for giving an opportunity to chair this section. I also thank today's speaker, Dr. Yugraj Yadava and Sulagna Chattopadhyay, for giving informative talk on very burning problems, that is the sustainable fisheries talk and IU fishing and is marine litter and plastic pollution. But before conclusion, I think that we must do some action. We must have some action to control this marine plastic pollution and marine litter, as well as to have sustainable fishery stock all over the oceans, that is the west and east coast of India. Once again, I thank you, ICWA, and I over to ICWA.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. We will now take a break and reconvene at 14 hours for the next session. Thank you.